My beloved child. Stop scrolling for a moment. Do not rush past these words, because what you are about to hear is not about a love story that simply ended. It is about a story that was interrupted. There is a difference between something that dies naturally and something that is deliberately torn apart. And somewhere in the silence between what you believed happened and what actually happened, a truth has been waiting. Pause here, my child. Take one slow breath. Because in this fictionalized message, heaven is opening a door that was once kept firmly shut. You thought the distance meant your soulmate stopped caring. You thought the silence meant they had chosen someone else. You thought the strange changes in their behavior were proof that their heart had moved away from you. But what if that was never the complete story? What if there was someone standing between two hearts who knew exactly what they were doing? What if the person you blamed was not the person who caused the separation? And what if, after all this time, your soulmate finally became brave enough to face the one person who had been hiding behind the destruction of your love story? My child, listen carefully, because this is where everything begins to change. There was a conversation that almost never happened. A confrontation that could have been avoided. A truth that could have remained buried for years. But something inside your soulmate finally broke through the fear. Not their love. Their fear. For a long time, your soulmate carried something heavy inside their heart. They carried words they had never spoken. They carried memories they had never explained. They carried questions they were too afraid to ask. And every time your name entered their mind, those unanswered questions became louder. They remembered the beginning. They remembered the moments when everything felt effortless. They remembered the way your presence made ordinary moments feel different. They remembered conversations that lasted longer than they were supposed to. They remembered the little details that no one else would have noticed. The look in your eyes. The sound of your voice. The way you could make them feel understood without demanding an explanation. They remembered how naturally the connection developed. And then they remembered how suddenly everything changed. One day there was warmth. Then confusion. Then distance. Then silence. And somewhere between those moments, someone began feeding your soulmate a version of reality that was never completely true. At first, the manipulation was subtle. It did not sound like an attack. It sounded like concern. That is what made it so dangerous. Someone said something like, "I am only telling you this because I care about you." Someone else whispered, "You should be careful." Another warning came disguised as advice. Maybe you do not really know this person. And your soulmate listened. Not because they stopped loving you. Because they trusted the person speaking. That distinction changes everything. My child, sometimes the greatest damage is not done by someone who openly declares war against you. Sometimes it is done by someone who smiles while planting doubt. A single sentence can become a seed. A seed becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes fear. Fear becomes distance. And distance begins to look like rejection. That is how a beautiful connection can be made to appear broken. But heaven saw every step. Every conversation. Every carefully chosen word. Every moment when your soulmate was told something about you that they had no reason to believe was false. And yet, deep inside, something never completely accepted it. There was always a quiet voice inside them saying, "Something does not make sense." They tried to silence that voice. They tried to move forward. They tried to convince themselves that leaving was the right thing. They told themselves they were protecting their future. They told themselves they were avoiding pain. They told themselves that perhaps the connection had only been temporary. But then something happened. They saw something. Not something dramatic at first. Something small. A detail that did not match the story they had been given. And that small detail became the first crack in the wall. Suddenly, memories began returning. Not just memories of you. Memories of conversations with the person who had influenced them. Memories of warnings. Memories of strange reactions. Memories of moments when that person seemed almost too interested in what was happening between you and your soulmate. And your soulmate began asking themselves a question they had been avoiding for a long time. Why did they care so much about keeping us apart? That question changed everything. Because once someone begins asking the right question, the old story becomes difficult to believe. Your soulmate started going backward through the past. They replayed conversations. They examined messages. They remembered dates. They remembered who said what. They remembered when the sudden change began. And then they noticed something disturbing. The timeline did not make sense. The warnings had appeared before the supposed problems. The accusations had appeared before the misunderstandings. The doubt had appeared before there was even a reason to doubt you. It was almost as if someone had been preparing your soulmate to walk away before your soulmate even knew they were going to. My child, imagine the emotional weight of realizing that. Imagine discovering that the person you trusted was not simply giving advice. They were influencing your decisions. They were shaping the way you saw someone you loved. They were placing their interpretation between you and the person your heart was trying to understand. Your soulmate did not know what to do with that realization. For several days, they remained quiet. They watched. They listened. They remembered. And eventually, the question became impossible to ignore. They needed the truth. Not another explanation. Not another excuse. Not another version of the story. The truth. So they decided to face the person. And that confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a simple question. A question so ordinary that the person sitting across from them did not immediately understand how serious the moment was. Your soulmate looked at them and said, "Why did you tell me that?" The room became quiet. The other person hesitated. That hesitation said more than words could. Your soulmate noticed it. For the first time, they were not listening only to the answer. They were watching the reaction. And the reaction was strange. There was defensiveness. Then confusion. Then an attempt to change the subject. But your soulmate did not allow it. They asked again. "Why did you tell me that?" The person tried to explain. They said they had only been trying to help. They said they were protecting your soulmate. They said they never wanted anything bad to happen. But your soulmate had already heard those words before. And this time, they were not enough. Because the deeper question was not whether that person claimed to care. The deeper question was why their advice had repeatedly pushed your soulmate away from you. Your soulmate leaned forward. Their voice became quieter. And sometimes, my child, a quiet voice carries more power than a scream. They said, "Tell me exactly what you knew." That sentence changed the atmosphere. The person stopped. For a moment, nobody spoke. And then came the first confession. Not the whole truth. Just a piece. A small piece. But it was enough to make your soulmate realize that there was much more hidden beneath the surface. The person admitted they had spoken about you. They admitted they had shared things they had heard. But they insisted that some of what they said was misunderstood. Your soulmate asked, "Then why did you make me believe it was a fact?" Silence. Again. That silence became unbearable. And your soulmate remembered something you once told them. Maybe you never said it exactly like this. But the meaning remained in their heart. Do not believe everything you hear about me. If you ever have a question, ask me. At the time, they had not understood the importance of those words. Now they did. And suddenly they realized they had broken the one rule that could have saved everything. They never asked you. They believed someone else. That realization hurt. Not because they had been fooled. but because they finally understood how much their decision had cost both of you. Your soulmate looked down. Their hands trembled slightly. And for the first time, the person sitting across from them saw something they had never expected to see. Regret. Real regret. Not anger. Not jealousy. Not revenge. Regret. Your soulmate said, "You made me believe they were the problem." The other person replied, "I was trying to protect you." Your soulmate looked up. And this time, there was no uncertainty in their eyes. They asked the question that had been waiting inside them for years. Protect me from what? The person had no immediate answer. And that was the moment your soulmate knew. There had been something else. Something they had never been told. Something hidden. Something deliberately left out. My beloved child, this is where the story becomes deeper than you expected. Because the person who interfered was not simply afraid that you would hurt your soulmate. They were afraid of what would happen if your soulmate chose you. That is a completely different motivation. Fear can make people do strange things. Fear of losing influence. Fear of losing control. Fear of being left behind. Fear of seeing someone they depended on build a life without them. And sometimes, people confuse their fear with love. They call control protection. They call interference concern. They call manipulation advice. But your soulmate was beginning to see the difference. They asked, "Did you ever actually want us to be together?" The person looked away. That movement was almost imperceptible. But your soulmate saw it. And their heart sank. Because sometimes the truth arrives before the confession. Sometimes the body reveals what the mouth is trying to hide. Your soulmate waited. Finally, the person said something that changed everything. They admitted they had doubts about you from the beginning. But your soulmate interrupted. Doubts based on what? The answer came slowly. Things I had heard. From whom? Silence. Who told you? Another silence. And now your soulmate understood that this was not one conversation. There was a chain. One person had heard something from another. Another person had repeated it. And eventually, the story had reached your soulmate so distorted that it no longer resembled reality. But there was still one missing piece. Who started it? Your soulmate asked that question. The person refused to answer. Not directly. They stood up. They walked toward the window. They stared outside. And then they said, "You are better off not knowing." My child, those words often reveal the existence of a secret more clearly than any confession. Your soulmate became angry. Not because they wanted revenge. Because they had finally realized how much of their life had been influenced by something they were never allowed to understand. They said, "You do not get to decide what I am better off knowing." And that was the moment the confrontation became real. The person turned around. Their expression changed. The calm mask disappeared. And suddenly, they said something they had probably never intended to reveal. They said, "You do not understand what would have happened if you had stayed with them." Your soulmate froze. Why? The person did not answer. Why? Again. Nothing. Your soulmate stepped closer. Tell me why. And then came the words that made their heart stop. There was a reason we needed you to stay away. Not, I wanted you to stay away. We. My child, pay attention to that word. We. Your soulmate heard it. And suddenly, the entire past looked different. This was not one person's decision. Someone else had been involved. Someone else knew. Someone else had benefited from the separation. And now your soulmate had to know who. They asked, "Who else?" The person shook their head. Leave it alone. But your soulmate was no longer the person who had walked into that room. Something had awakened inside them. They had spent too long accepting silence. Too long accepting half-truths. Too long pretending that the ache in their heart was simply something they had to live with. They said, "I lost someone because of this." The person replied, "You made your own choice." And that sentence cut deeply. Because your soulmate realized they had been allowed to believe their decision was entirely their own. But how free is a decision when someone has carefully controlled the information behind it? That question echoed inside them. They remembered every moment they pulled away from you. Every time they ignored a message. Every time they acted cold. Every time they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves. Every night they wondered whether you hated them. Every morning they told themselves they were doing the right thing. And now they were realizing that perhaps they had never been given the full truth. Their eyes filled with tears. They whispered your name. The person heard it. And something about the way your soulmate said your name revealed that the feelings had never disappeared. They had only been buried. Buried under confusion. Buried under pride. Buried under fear. Buried under someone else's story. And suddenly, your soulmate asked something they had never asked before. Do they know? The person looked confused. Know what? That I still love them. Silence. That silence was the answer. Your soulmate realized that someone had known. Someone had always known. Someone knew your soulmate's feelings had not disappeared. And yet, they allowed the distance to continue. Why? That question became the center of everything. Your soulmate stepped back. They were no longer trying to understand the past only for themselves. They were thinking about you. They wondered how many nights you had spent questioning your own worth. How many times you wondered why someone who once looked at you with love suddenly became distant. How many times you blamed yourself. How many times you thought, maybe I was not enough. And my child, this is where I want you to hear something deeply important within this fictional spiritual story. The silence of another person is not proof of your unworthiness. Someone else's confusion is not a measurement of your value. Someone else's manipulation does not define the truth of who you are. And sometimes, the person who walked away was carrying a battle you could not see. Your soulmate was carrying one. And now that battle had finally reached the surface. They asked one last question. Did you ever tell them that I was going to come back? The person stared at them. Your soulmate continued. Did you ever tell them I still loved them? No answer. Did you? Finally, the person whispered, yes. Your soulmate closed their eyes. A tear rolled down their cheek. Not because they were surprised. Because somewhere deep inside, they had always known. They had felt it. They had sensed that the story was incomplete. And now the confirmation hurt more than the uncertainty. They asked, then why did you keep us apart? The person looked at them. And for several seconds, there was nothing. Then they said something that your soulmate would never forget. I thought I was saving you. Your soulmate shook their head. No. The person looked confused. Your soulmate wiped their face. You were saving yourself. And that sentence ended the old version of the story. The person became silent. Because sometimes truth does not need to be shouted. Sometimes it only needs to be spoken once. Your soulmate turned toward the door. But before leaving, they stopped. They looked back. And they asked, what else don't I know? The person did not answer. Your soulmate waited. Nothing. Then the person finally said, if you really want the truth, you need to ask them. Your soulmate's heart began racing. Ask who? The person looked directly into their eyes. And then they said a name. A name your soulmate had never expected to hear. A name connected to the beginning of everything. A name that would force them to reconsider not only why you were separated, but why someone wanted your soulmate to believe that your love was dangerous in the first place. My child, this is where the hidden door opens. Because the person your soulmate confronted was not the final source of the deception. They were only one part of it. There was another person. Someone who knew more. Someone who had been watching. Someone who understood the connection between you and your soulmate long before either of you realized how deep it was. And now your soulmate had a choice. They could walk away again. They could pretend they had heard enough. They could protect themselves from another painful truth. Or they could finally follow the evidence all the way to the beginning. For years, fear had controlled that choice. But something had changed. Your soulmate was no longer asking, "How do I forget them?" They were asking, "What really happened to us?" That is a completely different question. And once a heart begins searching for truth, it becomes very difficult to return to a comfortable lie. Your soulmate left that confrontation carrying more questions than answers. They sat alone afterward. No music. No distractions. No conversations. Just silence. They opened their phone. Your name was still there. They stared at it. Their finger hovered over your contact. They could have called. They could have sent a message. They could have written everything they were feeling. But they stopped. Not because they did not want to speak. Because they knew they had not yet uncovered everything. They did not want to return to you with another half-truth. This time, if they came back, they wanted to come back with honesty. They wanted to tell you what happened. They wanted to explain why they disappeared. They wanted to admit what they believed. They wanted to tell you who influenced them. But there was one thing they were still afraid of. What if you no longer cared? What if too much time had passed? What if the pain had changed you? What if you had learned to live without them? That fear stopped them from pressing the call button. And yet, my child, something extraordinary happened next. They opened an old conversation. A conversation they had never deleted. Your last meaningful exchange. They read it again. Then again. And something they had overlooked years ago suddenly stood out. One sentence. One tiny sentence. It contained a detail that matched something they had just heard during the confrontation. Your soulmate's breathing changed. They went back through the messages. They searched. They found another conversation. Then another. The pattern became clearer. The person who had interfered had not only influenced what your soulmate believed. They had been present at specific moments when misunderstandings began. They had known details they should not have known. Details that your soulmate had never personally shared with them. That realization sent a chill through their heart. How did they know? That was the question. How did that person know? Unless someone else had told them. Or unless they had been involved much earlier than anyone realized. Your soulmate kept searching. And then they found something. A message. An old message. Something that had been buried among hundreds of ordinary conversations. They opened it. They read the first line. Their face changed. They read it again. Then they whispered your name. Because the message contained information that could not have been known by accident. It referred to a private moment between you and your soulmate. A moment only a very small number of people could have known about. And suddenly, your soulmate understood. Someone had been watching the relationship from much closer than they ever realized. Someone had information. Someone had access. Someone had a motive. And now, for the first time, the pieces were beginning to connect. But there was still one question. Why? Why would anyone go this far to destroy a love story? Why would anyone spend so much time creating doubt? Why would anyone risk being exposed? The answer was not simple. And it was not what your soulmate expected. Because the person behind the separation was not driven only by jealousy. There was another reason. A reason connected to the future your soulmate might have built with you. A future that would have changed the lives of people around them. A future that someone desperately wanted to prevent. Your soulmate stared at the screen. Their heart was beating faster. They realized the confrontation had only been the beginning. The person they had faced had finally opened one door. But behind that door was another. And behind that one, another. They had spent years believing the love story ended because two people could not make it work. Now they were beginning to understand something completely different. Maybe it had not ended. Maybe it had been interrupted. Maybe the separation was never the conclusion. Maybe it was the darkest chapter before the truth could finally surface. And perhaps that is why, even after all this time, your soulmate still felt something whenever your name appeared. Because some connections do not disappear simply because people stop speaking. They remain as unfinished questions. They remain in memories. They remain in dreams. They remain in the quiet moments when a person suddenly wonders, what if? But your soulmate was no longer satisfied with, what if? They wanted the truth. They wanted your truth. They wanted their truth. And they wanted the truth about the person who had stood between you. The next morning, your soulmate made a decision. They would meet the person whose name had just been revealed. Not over the phone. Not through messages. Face to face. Because there are truths that cannot be understood through a screen. They needed to see the reaction. They needed to hear the voice. They needed to ask one question that had haunted them for years. Why did you destroy our love story? But my child. There was something your soulmate did not know. The person they were about to confront already knew they were coming. And they had been waiting for this moment. Not for days. Not for weeks. For years. Because they knew that eventually, the truth would find its way back to the two hearts they had separated. Your soulmate arrived at the meeting place. They walked inside. They looked around. Their hands were steady this time. Their heart was not. Then the door opened. The person entered. They looked at your soulmate. And for one long moment, neither of them spoke. Then your soulmate placed the old message on the table. The person's face went pale. Your soulmate said only 4 words. Explain this to me. The person looked at the message. Then at your soulmate. And finally, they whispered something that changed everything. You were never supposed to find that. Your soulmate leaned forward. Why? The person took a deep breath. Their eyes filled with fear. And then they said. There is something about your soulmate that you were never told. Your soulmate froze. Because suddenly, the story was no longer only about who separated you. It was about what someone had been trying to hide about you. And the next words were about to reveal a truth so unexpected that even your soulmate was not prepared to hear it. But before they could speak, the door behind them suddenly opened. Someone else had arrived. Someone your soulmate recognized immediately. Someone connected to the very first lie. And the moment your soulmate saw who was standing there, they realized the person they had just confronted had never been the mastermind. They had only been protecting the real secret. And now, for the first time, the person who knew the entire truth was standing directly in front of them. Your soulmate looked at them. Their eyes widened. And the stranger slowly closed the door behind them. Then they said the words that made your soulmate's entire world stop. If you really want to know why you and your soulmate were separated, you need to hear what happened the night they first decided to let you go. Your soulmate's heart dropped. Because that night was the night they had always believed you abandoned them. But now they were about to discover that you had not made that decision alone. Someone had been there. Someone had spoken to you. Someone had given you information. And someone had convinced you that walking away was the only way to protect the person you loved. Your soulmate stared at the stranger. Their voice trembled. What did you tell them? The stranger did not answer. Instead, they reached into their pocket. They pulled out an old phone. They placed it on the table. And on that screen was a recording. A recording from the exact night your soulmate thought they lost you forever. Their fingers began to tremble. They looked at the screen. The stranger pressed play. And then your soulmate heard your voice. Their own name was spoken. The room became completely silent. Your soulmate covered their mouth. Because the recording did not sound like the person who had rejected them. It sounded like someone crying. Someone afraid. Someone being pressured into a decision they did not want to make. And then, beneath your trembling voice, another voice could be heard. A voice your soulmate recognized. The voice of the person who had been standing between you all along. The recording continued. And just before the most important sentence was revealed, the screen went black. Your soulmate looked up. Why did you stop it? The stranger slowly looked at them. And their answer was barely a whisper. Because the rest of the recording will tell you exactly who destroyed your love story. Your soulmate stared at the phone. Their eyes filled with tears. Their hands tightened. And somewhere deep inside, the truth they had been searching for all these years was finally within reach. But the recording had not ended. It had only been paused. And the next voice they were about to hear was the voice of the person your soulmate trusted more than anyone. The person who had convinced them to let you go. The person who knew exactly what would happen if the truth ever came out. And when that voice finally began speaking, your soulmate would discover that the separation between you was never the whole secret. It was only the beginning.